So here we have the spine coming down. Now, when you put your hands on your hips, this is where you put them, okay? Your hands on top of the hips. This whole bone here is all the hip or the pelvic bone, all right? So when we're born, it's actually 3 separate bones, and then they fuse as we go through life. And here is the socket for the hip joint, which is a ball and socket joint. So at the top of the thigh bone, we have a ball, and that sits in the socket there. So the sacrum is this triangular bone here, and it slots into the 2 pelvic bones at these very large joints, sacroiliac joints. So there you are, really up close, okay? Let's turn it around over the top there. You can you see even there, even though this is just a plastic one, you can see that there's reciprocal bumps and grooves there on the 2 bones so that they really fit hand in glove. There we see them on the back there, okay. Now the sacroiliac joint is held together by the strongest ligaments in the body. And there are schools of thought that the sacroiliac joints fuse, okay, especially in men and as we get older. There's a lot of debate around this, so I'm not going to get involved in the debate, but I always think of these joints as having a little bit of what we in the trade call joint play. All right, now I love that. And it's that idea that there is always the ability for them to accommodate. So look, if I was to bring my knuckles in here, right here, and you imagine that as the sacroiliac joint, can you imagine if I'm walking, okay, I'm stepping up. Can you see how we've got that little bit of movement there? And look how that tiny little bit of movement in here translates into, look at the movement of my thumbs up there, okay? So that little bit of joint play actually allows a lot of activity further away from the joints. So when we're walking, it's very hard for me to imagine that these sacroiliac joints fuse in the majority of people. So we've got the sacroiliac joints there. Now, if you can imagine the leg in here, the thigh bone in here, and as we move that, it reaches a point, doesn't matter which direction we move it in, there reaches a point where the movement at the hip joint runs out. There isn't any more movement to be had. And so what will happen instead is the pelvic bone on that side will start to move. The hip joint's gone as far as it can, and so now the pelvic joint will move. Now at the sacroiliac joints, we only have what we call joint play. So whether or not you think they fuse or whether there's just joint play, either way, it's not a lot of movement. So if, let's just say we do a really big hip movement, the hip joint itself runs out of anywhere to go, the pelvis goes to move, there's only a small amount of movement, tiny amount of movement at the sacroiliac joint, what then is going to move? It's going to be the spine, isn't it? And that's what happens for so many people. When they go to bend their knees up towards the chest, the hips, if they're stiff, they run out really quickly. And so what happens is we end up taking the spine into flexion, which is the same as a slumped position, which is the same as what we tend to call poor posture. Okay, now of course if we're doing a flexion exercise of the low back, then of course we want to bring it into flexion, and it's not poor posture at all, but that's not how we want to spend life. It's not very healthy for our spine. So it's one of the, this is not one of the reasons, it's one of the primary reasons why what we really want to do is make sure that we loosen these hips, that the hips are really nice and flexible, so that instead of always having to take up that movement in the lumbar spine, the hips are doing their job.